Hey, it's Ben from ZOAR Fitness, and on this Ask Ben episode, I'm going to be answering how does programming change for open versus master athletes? All right. So this question came from Stacy Coach, one of my coaches, and she said, "How would your programming for a 25-year-old female different from a 45-year-old female?" All right. So I'm actually going to break this into two parts. I'm going to answer part sort of like one of the question this week and then part two next week. So part one I'm going to say is the open versus masters athlete, like the age component of this. And the second piece is going to be the gender related component. So go to episode 9 if you want to see that, or wait till next week if it's not out yet. All right. So again, we're talking about the age component, right? Someone who's late teens, early 20s versus someone who's at least 35, going on 45, 50s, possibly even 60s, right? So realize that whoever this is, all the same principles are going to apply as like the decades go by. They're just going to be more important and just slowly, like there's going to be different degrees of that, right? So I think first thing that's important is that we realize that there's going to be more similarities in people's training than differences for the most part, right? So there's just going to be good training principles that we abide by, and that applies whether you're relatively young or a little bit older, right? And again, I think sometimes the younger people can get away with it more, but that does not mean that it's not optimal to train a certain way, right? So moving on, I think the first thing that we have to think about is we have to prioritize recovery as a master's athlete, right? So, and I think different people have different opinions on what recovery is. So first of all, what is it not, right? So I would say, it is not like massage guns, like cryotherapy. It couldn't even like body work, right? Which is like all those things are great, but for most people, the amount of money and time and energy that they put into them isn't worth the return, right? Like it's like 1%. It's like trying to like save your sinking ship with like an eyedropper, right? Like for most people, that's not going to work for them, right? Whereas something that's more effective, like what this is going to be, it's really just about limiting the number of doses that you have so that you're never over kind of extending yourself too much, right? Where you can actually come back and rebound quicker from that. Any sort of like trick, tip, hack. Again, if you're like a games athlete or like independently wealthy, like go for all of those things, right? However, if you don't have the time or the resources to be able to do that, then again, it's just something that you have to kind of think about, okay, like what things am I going to pull out of my training that might not necessarily is going to work for, right? So we're thinking about more of like, what can we do to reduce the recovery demand rather than really trying to accelerate recovery, right? The exception with those things are sleep and nutrition. I think those are the most important things that we can do that's going to speed recovery if we're sleeping correct amount of time and if we are, again, staying within our cycles and kind of having these good sleep hygiene habits, like avoiding screens late at night, that sort of thing, right? And then also just being able to get real food, right? If you get real food, you're going to be better off, right? So that's number one. All right. If we kind of go into what things should you prioritize and increase in your training versus what things we should limit our doses in, let's start with actually in limited doses, right? So first thing that we're going to reduce is volume, right? Just be, like the total work that you do needs to be less, and that's going to reduce the recovery demand, right? I'll note that during certain times you're going to have to increase volume, but how you do that is probably going to be a little bit lower intensity environments where you're extending more into muscular endurance and not really creating a ton of fatigue from that. And that's something where you can build work capacity and the recovery demand isn't as great, right? So a little caveat there. And then next, I would say number of lactic efforts. Lactic being like if you're having like a burning sensation, it's really hard. It's extremely difficult for you to sustain that. Think about like mid-range assault bike sprints, 400-meter runs at like a high effort, even like any sort of like traditional CrossFit workout, like that's like a Metcon mixed modal where you're like Fran, right? Like those sort of efforts, even something like Jackie, all right? All those would kind of fall into that. So basically the toll that puts on your CNS is just really high, and it doesn't have a super high return on investment, all right? And it's also going to hurt some of the metrics on this side that we're wanting to increase. So I just think it's something that, again, it's just, again, it has certain, especially certain times of the year, like in comp prep, like you're not going to avoid that completely. Like there's no way to get away from that because that's the sport. But at the same time, limiting the number of doses, how often you see those things, so like maybe once or twice per week would be really good, especially in off season. And then lastly, we have to think about how often we're actually hitting different patterns, like the frequency of that, just because we're trying to reduce the joint strain, right? So if you're squatting, 5 times a week, and a lot of people actually squat more than that in different capacities, like wall balls, cleans, squat snatches, and something else, like step ups, right? Like all those things are going, it's basically the same pattern, all those things, right? So we can't just think about like, oh, I've done cleans, right? Or I've done wall balls, and now we just think about the movement patterns as a whole and not trying to hit the same single patterns every day, not trying to load the shoulders every single day, like those sort of things, right? All right, so if we've avoided some of those pitfalls, what things are actually going to increase? So the training priorities, number one is strength and power, right? So as you age, like you basically have a much harder time recruiting motor units, right? So like you have a more difficult time having like refined skilled movement. Okay, we'll hit that. And then also just having like the gross capacity and raw power, right? Like that just starts to diminish. Muscle mass starts to deteriorate a little bit, and we can certainly fight that with strength and power activities, right? So again, I would say this is like alactic power, which is like probably less than like 15 seconds. So if you're doing like assault bike sprints and it's going more than 15 seconds, unless you're not extremely powerful, right? Like then I would say that's more of a lactic effort, right? So we got to keep that on the shorter end, max effort. And then we're going to do other, obviously, like traditional strength. Like, again, these are fundamental motor patterns: squat, press, hinge, pull, midline, right? Skill work. Again, I think one of the biggest things that separates masters athletes is if they have certain skills, right? So if you can walk on your hands, do strict handstand push-ups, be able to do muscle ups as a masters athlete, you're probably already in like the top 1%, right? So, and again, this is like adding layers. It's like one at a time, right? So if we can do pull-ups, great. Let's get to a chest to bar, right? If we can get to a chest to bar, okay, now we can start to build in that first muscle up, right? If we can do that, we can start to cycle reps, right? If we can do that, we can add density, right? So it's the same thing. We can do that for any skill, like double unders, for example, right? Or again, like any sort of pressing gymnastics, handstand walking, all those things. So again, I would say that's actually going to be a pretty big focal point in doing that in environments where you're not fatigued. Right? Aerobic work. So if we're not doing a lot of hard lactic efforts, like the kind of contrast to that is we're doing more aerobic, more sustainable efforts, right? We're able to, again, kind of walk away from that and be able to like not be laying on the floor afterwards, right? And again, think about the recovery demand that's putting on you versus you could do a whole lot more of this, add the volume right here. But at the same time, it's going to be more sustainable and more practical and more, again, sustainable in the course of like the long term as well, right? Then last, mobility, right? And one of the things that really limits people in strength and power and their expression is kind of their elasticity, and just, again, that kind of combination of range of motion, torque, that mobility is, right? And then like being able to combine that in ways that are skilled. So like, again, even as simple as like practical, like applying this mobility work to like something like the Ollie lifts, right? Extremely important. So there you have it, guys. Let me know if you got questions. Feel free to go to the form at the bottom, fill that out, and if you got other Ask Ben episode questions that you'd like to ask, I'd be happy to answer those. And stay tuned for next week. I'll cover the next part of this where we're talking about male versus female athletes and how I would change things based on someone's gender. All right. We'll see you next time.